what the modern state has done in running a experimental mass immigration policy and a subsequent multicultural management policy is to pry apart all the old organic loyalties that led to a high trust society. So they've diminished the value of family, they've diminished the value of faith, of community. They have made, as even Keir Starmer has now said, a nation of strangers for themselves. And so you've just got a series of atomized, consuming and working occasionally individuals in direct relationship with the state. And so the state has to intervene to stop all of these individuals squabbling, especially when, for some groups more than others, tribal loyalties resurface. And in order to try and make this febrile, divided, diverse social environment work, the state has refashioned a new narrative about Britain, which is just patently absurd. I mean, even in that immigration restriction speech that Starmer gave a few weeks ago, he got up and said that immigration is an unalloyed benefit for this country because think about all the people that came over and rebuilt after the Second World War. He's referring to the Windrush. Now, look, I'm sure plenty of people in Britain today are very nice people and have either come on the Windrush or have descendants from the Windrush. Let's not pretend that they came over like pilgrims going to Plymouth Rock to settle a barren wasteland, or went from Jamaica, which is much better weather, to Britain out of the kindness of their hearts. The majority went over because they were promised lucrative jobs as bus conductors. You know, fair enough. I'm not shocked that you go for your own economic opportunity, but let's not pretend that those people are somehow our moral betters. Let's not pretend that we wouldn't have had a nice country without them, because we always had, comparative to many other countries. That's why lots of people have come here. And let's not pretend now that everyone in the world is a Briton in waiting who does want to come to Britain and live as the Romans do, rather than terraform our culture and recreate the failed conditions of their homeland. So I think there is no one binding, cohesive narrative that represents the people who would call this place home. There is no narrative which puts burdens to conform and involve themselves in the national project on newcomers and new arrivals. If anything, their completely incompatible traditions are put above the preferences of the host population. And the version of events told by our political class that increasingly everyone of every political stripe has next to no faith in, the diversity built Britain, as Rishi Sunak, again, someone nobody ever voted for, minted on a coin and grinned next to. That idea, no, nobody actually buys into it, even if they want it to be ideologically the case. So yeah, I think that without a shared and binding narrative, you cannot have a cohesive culture, but one does not exist at the moment, which makes me concerned for our ability to dig ourselves out of this particular hole.
Is it not enough to have a general narrative that humans are worth something and sort of take that humanist stance? Is that not enough to patch up multiculturalism and make us all get along and sort of, that's a narrative, isn't it?
That narrative is particularly culturally exclusive to the Christian, we'll say West, but mainly the English-speaking world, because we have had generations of encoding the idea of Imago Dei out of religious suppositions. This is the concept of human rights. This is why human rights have replaced Christianity as a kind of secular religion. And this is why when the Universal Declaration on Human Rights from the United Nations or the European Convention on Human Rights were passed in 1952 after the horrors of the Holocaust and nobody wanted to commit them again, they were writing down what the victorious Allies saw, Soviet Union accepted, as self-evident. And the issue is, even if you translate them into other languages, they're not self-evident to other cultures. I mean, as we've seen from the mass migration from the Muslim world, especially the grooming gang scandal that's happened recently, morality is only extended in as far as it advantages the family, the clan, or the ummah. There's this term in Arabic, there's asabaya, which basically means clannish loyalty. And so you look at every interaction, whether it's just asserting a truth claim or whether it's some sort of grave moral evil committed against the most vulnerable, and you say, would fessing up to this disadvantage my family? Would it decrease their honor and standing in relation to others? Okay, then I'll just stay silent. And we know this is the case because lots of families knew what their brothers, cousins, husbands, and sons were doing in 50 towns and cities all across the UK and stayed silent. Worse still, when they were convicted, the daughters of the perpetrators would shout out in court, "I love you, Dad." Yes, exactly. So it's all well and good to say, like Rory Stewart, I have this abstract universalist love for all humanity, even if I don't know them. That is very culturally particular. And it would take probably centuries, as it did for our culture, to reach a sufficient state where that seems self-evident to them. And they are, again, the centuries that they are behind us is a stumbling block. I would just say, leave them to their own devices, allow them to develop a morality in their own standing, and obviously don't fund the demented governments, as we are giving foreign aid to places like Pakistan or Iran, who are inflicting untold horrors upon their recalcitrant population. Instead, what we've done is, because of the narrative of the Second World War, that the absolute worst thing to be ever is a racist, and racist is defined as just noticing differences between peoples, nations, and cultures, not thinking that someone's inferior because of the color of their skin, which originally wasn't even, the term racist wasn't even applied to that. That was bigotry. That was like sort of arbitrary prejudice against someone because they just look different to you, which we abhor. Because of the Second World War narrative that if you're a racist, you're literally Hitler. Hitler killed lots and lots of people. Therefore, you don't want to be Hitler. Therefore, the most moral thing to do in the world is not to consult your own conscience. Just think of what Hitler did and do the opposite. We now pretend, or at least act as if it is true as a matter of government policy, that there are no such thing as cultural differences. Everything's arbitrary. People are just pried apart by the cruel injustice of geography, and that any difference in education, economic attainment, or cultural preference can be eradicated by just taking a man from Mogadishu and dropping him in Manchester. As if the passport gates of Heathrow and Gatwick are magic portals through which you pass and you suddenly become showered in British values and you just pick up peace and prosperity by cultural osmosis. And this is a fiction that is ultimately costing a lot of people money, pain and suffering, and ultimately lives. And so I don't think that we should continue to perpetuate the narrative that bland Scouts pledge of British values, which means, tolerance and liberalism and a general love of humanity, is sufficient to bind everyone together from all corners of the world.
I think something I've discovered the last year is how powerful the stories we tell ourselves are. And it sounds dumb in some senses to say, if you don't have the same shared story or narrative, there are going to be these problems that are happening. It kind of sounds like an underestimation of human potential. Like, sure, you might have different stories, but we can all agree that humans are amazing and deserve to flourish. But it's like, what are the presuppositions underlining that? And that's a very difficult thing to grapple with. And that's kind of been what has red-pilled me, so to speak, on the whole immigration thing. And also spending a lot of time traveling and seeing these fundamentally different places with different narratives that govern everything they do in life. What do you see as the trajectory now? We've just had Keir Starmer come out and give his speech that everyone's lambasted. And as usual, no one fucking likes him. What's next, both politically with the politicians and also maybe on a social level?
Okay, so the reason Starmer gave that speech is because Tony Blair has been ringing his phone red, saying you need to get a handle on this. You are bipolling the most unpopular prime minister in recorded history, and Reform are eating your lunch, especially at the local elections where they just became the largest party in England on the local level. And so he has provided anti-progressive window dressing to some twiddling of the dials on immigration that actually keeps levels of immigration above that we saw before Brexit. And Brexit in 2016 was not, as lots of the Leave.eu conservatives thought, an insistence on having more liquid trade with the rest of the world, or holding the EU to account on not allowing us to be Singapore on Thames, or bringing in more Indian doctors, which, by the way, have a much higher rate of medical malpractice than our own doctors. After we put a cap on the number of medical school places we allow here, to not devalue the profession, work that one out. No, it was about immigration. It was about, as Eric Kaufman's written in White Shift, not just concerns of economic sustainability and whether or not infrastructure can cope with the rapid population change, a lot of those were polite couchings of ethnic and cultural change concerns. And like it or not, ethnicity and culture is bound up in one another because there's a reason we put the prefix of a nationality or a people before a culture, like British values or American values, or even the American story or the British story, and it's because it belongs to a particular people and a place and a time. It happened, we can name them. And so if you feel yourself to be already a part of that people, you're more likely to buy into that as your story. Now, there are, again, people who have a hard break with their civilization and buy into a different story. And we can name them too. There's like Maya Tusi and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, or people who are half of one place and half another, like Ben Habib. Not every person from Somalia is Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Not every person from Pakistan is Ben Habib. And so we have to understand that they will likely be telling themselves a different story. None of that framing was evident in what Keir Starmer said. And it was telling that if you pour through the immigration white paper, very light on detail, he is farming out all of the specifics to quangos, these quasi-government NGOs that are not elected, that we have no ability to hold to account, and that believe dogmatically in the diversity, inclusion, and immigration ideology. So, are things going to get better before the next election? No. Things are going to keep getting worse. The economic situation is probably going to keep entering a death spiral because we're hemorrhaging our millionaires. Nobody wants to invest. The tax burden is the highest since 1948 and only rising. We are plundering our food security with a punitive Marxist grave-robbing tax, and Mad Eb Miliband has decided to lump us with an over £3 trillion cost down the line to make the entire grid renewable, even though it's only going to meet about 27% of energy demands with no protection for blackouts. Basically, we're becoming like somewhere between Lebanon and South Africa. Not the best. Both failed states. So where are we going to be at the next election? Now, there's a tricky thing to predict. At the moment, it looks like Reform are riding high and Nigel Farage is the most likely person to become Prime Minister. I have a standing bet with Neil Ferguson that will be the case, but that is on the condition that Kemi Badenoch remains Conservative leader, and there are rumblings within the Conservative Party that they're not so happy about them slumping down to fourth place at 16% after they triumphed her as the second coming of Margaret Thatcher. So expect no confidence votes to go in and her probably to be replaced by Robert Jenrick, who's a much better politician. But by 2029, at the going rate, we're going to have a Reform government. And I have cast myself as a critical friend of Reform in that I am very happy that there's a populist insurgent movement, but I'm worried by a few things. Not their potential to win elections, as Matt Goodwin, respected academic, keeps pointing to as sort of legitimizing factor for Reform and why they're the only game in town. I'm concerned about their ability to attract and retain talent after the unconscionable treatment of Rupert Lowe, where the party chairman called the police on him. The party chairman of the anti-woke party called the police on him for hurty words apparently made 3 months ago, and now he's been cleared of a police investigation. They've lost their best MP and replaced them with Sarah Pochin, who can't give a TV interview to save her life and just voted for the assisting dying bill to kill all pensioners to save money for the NHS. So I'm worried that if it keeps going in that direction and they keep employing this Ming vase strategy, so, carefully carrying the vase over the finish line to not be called racist, well, if the people that are carrying the vase, by the time you get to the finish line, didn't believe in carrying the vase for the first place, they're just going to drop it when you get there. And so I'm worried they're going to, in dropping the vase, they're going to look a lot more like Trump's term 1 when they win power than Trump's term 2. And that can be really damaging because, one, we don't have 5 years to screw around with the demographic and the cultural and the economic circumstances we face, but also, let's say that you have this once-in-a-generation opportunity to break up the sclerotic two-party structure, the two zombies propped against each other of Labour and Conservative. You walk in and you waste the opportunity because you haven't got your ducks in a row, you haven't got a slate of credible MPs, you haven't got all your legislation drafted, you don't know who your enemies are, and you don't know which battles to pick. That would be my worry. So they need to spend 4 years listening to people who can point them in the direction of policy, who can tell them which media outlets to engage with and which to brush off as the enemy, who to choose as candidates, and get them fighting fit to capitalise on the victory which currently looks inevitable.